A premium membership at Chess.com will help you improve your game with full access to a powerful set of learning tools. Unlimited tactics let you practice like a master, with more than 50,000 puzzles to challenge you at every level. Our library of interactive chess lessons, created by master coaches, will enhance every aspect of your game. And after each game you play, the computer analysis feature will give you feedback on every move you played, turning every game into a chance to learn. And that's not all. Premium benefits also include unlimited tournaments, video lessons, the Opening Explorer, and much, much more. Upgrade now to take your game to the next level.
One day after the China Pandas secured their spot in the 2020 Pro Chess League semifinals, we have the St. Louis Archbishops and the India Yogis vying for a spot against that team. I'm Grandmaster Robert Hess. Alongside me, well, not actually alongside me, because usually we're together in the same room. Alexandra Botez, I am a little upset, honestly, that you deserted me.
I know, Robert. This is going to be a very tough commentary day today. We're not in the same location as we have been the last couple of times, but I'm excited to be here to see how the matchup between St. Louis Archbishops, the favorite in the Pro Chess League, is going to go up against the Indian Yogis.
Yeah, we do have our probably strongest matchup of the entire playoffs and even the whole season. But as we look at the bracket, we see that St. Louis, India, the winner gets to take on the China Pandas. We had Li Chao on for an interview yesterday. He said that St. Louis is the overall favorite, no matter that India is bringing their superstar lineup. And on the other side of the bracket, we, of course, have Canada taking on Chicago Wind, and the Armenia Eagles will try to place in the semifinals once more when they take on the Hikaru Nakamura-led New York Marshals.
Absolutely. And we can also take a look at the players who are on the roster today. So for St. Louis, we have Fabiano, Lenier Dominguez Perez, Wesley So, Jeffrey Song, really a superstar team. And like you mentioned, India is also bringing out their super GMs. But unfortunately, Mamedyarov and Harikrishna haven't been performing as well as they should in the Pro Chess League. If they're able to up their game today, then the Indian Yogis have a shot at actually defeating the favorites here.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that Li Chao and many other people think that St. Louis will get through unscathed with no real challenge to what is seen as destiny, their throne. But the Archbishops are taking on a really tough team. And as we pull up our key game of the match, we'll see Fabiano Caruana take on Shakhriyar and Mamedyarov. And these two have played each other so many times. Fabiano would be the first person to admit just how strong Mamedyarov is in the quicker time controls. I know the season has not gone his way on an individual level thus far, but he was a free agent acquisition. He is uber talented, and I'm actually not so easily convinced that St. Louis will have a walk in the park in this match.
Yeah, Robert, I'm with you there. I think it's going to be closer than a lot of people expect, seeing the St. Louis Archbishops with their last couple of results in the bag, having won it twice already. It's easy to just think that they're going to get away with this matchup easily. But speaking of more questions, we have a daily question. What was your eureka moment that helped you understand chess on a deeper level? I know Robert has been dying to answer this question, so maybe he can let us know what he thinks. And then if you want to answer it as well, you can tweet at us with #ProChess.
Wow, love it. We're not physically in the same room today. The green screen not working quite as well as it usually does, and you're putting me on the spot because normally that's what I do to you. So I see how it is, Alexandra. I'm a big supporter of yours, the Botez Lab channel, but now you're throwing me under the bus. I see what's going on here.
I just thought you'd be excited to share. And a lot of us like to learn from you, Robert. You're a great teacher. You're a talented player, a talented commentator. So I'd love to hear your insights on this question.
Wow, that was a ton of moral support. So I love how I kind of went in the pity route, just like, please compliment me, and you did it. So this is a good start to what is going to be an excellent day, as the matches should get underway pretty much now. And Alexandra, I do this when we're commentating every single time. Your prediction for the match we're about to see unfold.
Well, I'm predicting that St. Louis is going to win by a 2-point lead.
Wow. Okay. So you think that it's going to be a 9-7 for St. Louis?
Yep. That's what I think.
I don't know. There's something about the India Yogis today that has me inspired, and I'm going to go for an 8-8 tiebreak. That's where I'm going with this one. I think that Mamedyarov finally breaks through and has a good day. He's going to score, I want to say 3 out of 4 against this ridiculously strong St. Louis lineup, and I think it's going to tiebreaks.
Okay, well, I hope that's going to be the situation, Robert. It's definitely going to be a very interesting matchup if we see that happening. And I can't think of a better team match than St. Louis Archbishops and Indian Yogis to go to tie breaks.
Okay, I mean, I just want to see everything unfold, honestly. And we are getting word that the game should start in a minute or two. And Mamedyarov getting everything set, making sure everything is ready. The players are all, getting in their seats and getting concentrated. So as we look from top to bottom of these lineups, Jeffrey Zhang on board 4 is, that's ridiculous, right? This guy is over 2,700. He's one of the young talents in the world of chess. But what do you make of Narayanan on board 4? Do you think he has a chance against this, just frankly, otherworldly talented lineup in St. Louis, or is he going to be downed and maybe even lose most of, if not all of his games?
That's a great question, Robert. If we're looking at how he's performed so far in the league, he's at 10.5 out of 16. He has a 27-42 performance so far. So he's definitely been holding his own against these top players. So I think if he's going to continue with the progress we've seen so far, he definitely has a shot to take down some of these top players. And even Fabiano Caruana has had some tough matches in the season. So I think it could be interesting.
I'm with you there. I think on paper, it seems like he's just going to have a ruinous day. But on the other hand, we've seen Narayanan perform throughout the season. And we also have seen players as strong as Fabiano Caruana have off weeks. And I can recall from this season, Fabiano's lost to Sam Sevian, and he struggled throughout that match despite scoring well with the New York Marshals. So it's not a sure thing. I am really, really excited to see in particular how Mamedyarov performs, but Harikrishna himself has not had the best season for the India Yogis, and he'll need to be in tip-top shape against the lineup that we see for St. Louis.
Yeah, it seems like Harikrishna's online chess has just not been as strong as his classical. Would you say there's a disparity there?
Oh, for sure. Harikrishna went 1/2 out of 4 against Norway, if I'm not mistaken, and that never happens in an over-the-board event. Something has been amiss with Pentala Harikrishna. I know from personal experience of playing him several times over the years. He's such a talented player. He's reached as high as 2760 in the classical FIDE ratings. So, he can turn on the jets at any moment. And this has to be the time because you can't afford any slip-ups against the Archbishops.
Definitely. Well, I'm ready for the games to get started.
So am I. I am really anticipating a hard-fought battle. I know, Alexandra, you have St. Louis winning 9-7. I ultimately think that probabilistically it's going to be a St. Louis win, but I just want the tiebreak so bad. I saw Hikaru Nakamura be the hero the people needed against the France Roosters, and now I want a tiebreak that I get to commentate on.
That's the same situation for me, Robert. I was able to watch that as a fan, but it would be fantastic to be able to commentate on one of those tiebreak matches.
Yeah, and it's just a fun format, right? The ladder format where board 4s start against each other, and you work your way down to the big boss in board 1. And Hikaru Nakamura was the big boss for the New York Marshals that the France Roosters were sent packing by. And in this matchup, I think it's actually particularly interesting because Fabiano Caruana, if it gets to a tiebreak, he's not really renowned as this exceptional blitz player, at least not relative to the likes of Shakhriyar Mamedyarov.
Yeah, and in the tiebreak system that we have, as you're mentioning, it's really the top board who will feel the most pressure because in order for the team to win the tiebreaks, they have to defeat board 1. So he would be the one having to try and hold it down. We just pulled up his stats card. As everybody knows, he is world number 2, but he is 2770 in rapid, and blitz is also a time control that he plays a lot less often versus Mamedyarov, who is similar rapid rating, but it just feels like he's the more experienced blitz player.
Yeah, and we've seen him perform better in blitz events, and they play in the Grand Chess Tour and all these other tournaments around the globe. And Mamedyarov, it feels like more consistently will perform at the absolute top of those events. But I think Fabiano Caruana at this point in his career is a little underestimated when it comes to blitz, just because of this sort of conversation where people are like, oh, he's not as good as Magnus, so that means he's bad, or he doesn't do so well in some of the Grand Chess Tour events. The Grand Chess Tour events are, just so difficult. You play 27 rounds of chess in like 5 days, where you play 3 rapid games a day and then 9 games of blitz on a given day. It's not easy. So, I have to be honest that Fabiano is not the best blitz player, but anything can happen, especially in this format. But we have liftoff Alexandria. We see Caruana taking on Narayanan with the black pieces here. And in this early going, it's Caruana who's off to a slow start on the clock. What do you make of that?
It seems like maybe he was just getting adjusted because he has blitzed out most of his moves afterwards. I don't think he's too unfamiliar with Areti position, and it seems to have transposed. His bishop is on g7 here. Where do you think he's going to try to develop the light squared bishop on c8?
Well, you know all about those really bad light square bishops. This is a French-style bishop trapped in by its own pawns. But I think he's just going to have to sit passively for a while. At some moment, he might play bishop g7 back to f8 to trade off this bishop on a3. And the reason you would do that is because your king side actually feels relatively safe for the time being, as you've a wall of pawns there, and white isn't making progress on that side, but it gives you the b4 square for your knight. That's really what black wants to achieve, is hop a pony into b4 and then claim that you have an outpost. That said, I prefer white's position. I think it's slightly better, just because in the current dynamic, that, as you mentioned, the bishop on c8 feels like a helpless piece.
It certainly does. And the position is extremely closed right now. So it seems like if there is going to be any break, it's going to be c takes d5 for white. It doesn't make a lot of sense for black to take d takes c4 in the future because he doesn't want to exchange one of his center pawns for a side pawn here. b6, so Fabiano is preparing bishop b7. Maybe he's going to consider a move like c5 in the future here. Can you talk a little bit about the timing on when you should consider exchanging and opening up this position?
Yeah, that's a great question, because with any sort of pawn push, there are going to be pros and cons. The pros being you start claiming more space for yourself, and your bishop from b7 will start gaining access to a longer diagonal. But the downside of playing a move like c5 is giving up control of the b5 square. As your pawn is already on a5, just like white's pawns are on a4 and c4, the b4 square becomes one that black wants to take advantage of. If you ever play c5, either the knight on c3, or even after some kind of capture on d5, the bishop might land on b5, gaining some more space for some of the white pieces instead of just the pawns. But it's going to be difficult as well for black to just sit and wait, as white gained more space with knight e5, can potentially play an f4 type of move. So it's really a game of, are you going to sit and do nothing and just shuffle your pieces, or are you going to feel the pressure and break through?
Well, speaking of pressure, I just looked at Wesley So games versus Harikrishna, and it seems like he's putting quite a bit of pressure on Black's position there. I'm not sure how Harikrishna is going to be able to get out of this pin and castle.
Yeah, that looks annoying anytime you see a king stuck on e8 and a queen or a bishop on that diagonal pinning a piece. The good news for Harikrishna, I would say, is that Wesley So is taking time. And the reason I point that out is because it looks, to both of us, I have to admit, it looks really sketchy. That's a suspicious looking position for black. But the fact that Wesley is taking more time than Harikrishna is might mean that we still are in some kind of preparation, as weird as it looks. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, if you look at the speed with which Harikrishna has gotten to this position, although Wesley did take over a minute to play bishop a5 here.
Right. And what he's trying to do is maybe open up some of the light squares on the queen side, because b6 would be the way to stop that bishop's attack and even attack the bishop. Said when the bishop retreats to a square like c3, now you look at the light squares on the queen side, a6, c6 opened up for white pieces. Bless you. And that is definitely something that would benefit white in some endgames.
Yeah, it certainly is. Do you think an idea like bishop d6, just trying to pressure the knight, if knight takes on d7, queen takes d7, queen takes d7, king takes d7. Well, I guess now that the queen just decided to move away instead of b6, maybe we could still play bishop d6 in the future here as a way of helping black eventually get his king to safety.
This queen c8 move looks suspicious to me. I have to be honest with you because, um, b6 had some concessions. We're talking about the light squares, but now you've sort of cut your rook off on a8. And if white were to get two moves in a row, I said a woe, you exactly castle queenside and then take on c5 and the knight on d7 is a goner. That's why black was forced to play this move f6. Um, but something about this position looks really off to me. For starters, you can consider taking on d7, just trading everything on that square, and then taking on c5 with check. And the problem for white is after king c6, you can play b4, but maybe this bishop on a5 looks a little awkward, but you are up a pawn for the time being. So I'm not really sure exactly how to evaluate this position. I'm guessing black is doing okay here, but you're just hanging on by a thread.
Yeah, certainly. Wesley is the one who's pushing for the advantage here. And maybe we could see if he's able to convert it and check on the third game we haven't seen yet between Grandmaster Adhiban and Lenier Dominguez Paris.
Okay, and Mamedyarov seems to have figured out his some of his issues, and he's now his game is Jeffrey Jean, has just begun. So we have all four games in progress. We will go to the Adhiban game against Dominguez, and I like that you pulled this one up, Alexandra, because let me ask you: White currently is down a pawn. It's this pawn on c4, and that can't be captured so easily because if you take on c4, this bishop a6. So the larger point, and as a d4 player, you should be familiar with this concept, of course, is giving up a pawn, any kind of queen's gambit, for the nice pawn chain in the center. So the floor is yours. What do you like and dislike about this position?
Right. Well, as you pointed out, this is something you often see in d4 structures, especially in the Catalan, where you fianchetto your bishop on g2, it's no longer protecting the c4 pawn. But white has an extremely strong center. All of white's minor pieces are developed, whereas black has much more of a cramped position and two doubled pawns on the c file. Even if white isn't able to recapture on c4 now, it's always a plan in the future, as well as something that white can continue to target, maybe with rook ac1.
Right. So if you want to just pile up more pieces on that square and try to get that pawn, and knight takes c4 always looks like the move that you want to play. But as we noted earlier, the bishop a6, there's a queen on e2 behind it. So that leaves some tactics up in the air that might be unfortunate for white. For instance, if you take on c4 last move, I would highly consider the move pawn to b5, as if you move your knight away from c4, then here comes pawn to b4, attacking the queen on e2, as well as the knight on c3. So I think tactically, it wouldn't have worked to take on c4, which is why rook fd1 was played. And now your idea to try to play c5 for black comes true with and the knight capture on c4. So a somewhat risky looking decision by Adhiban to take this pawn, but he has calculated that with the rook on c8 rather than a8, any sort of b5 allows white to just move this knight away, and the bishop on a6 is no longer defended. So just like the queen was under attack on a square like e2, here the bishop on a6 is a problematic piece because it's not protected. So actually even a takes b5, c b5, knight takes a5 simply wins a pawn, as you can't push to b4 without losing your bishop.
Well, maybe there are no tactics with bullying the knight on c4 now, but it does seem like that knight is a little bit stuck. What would you say regarding a plan like b3 to try to protect the knight and then just move out of the pin so that there's no tactics in the future for white here?
For sure. B3 is what white will more or less have to do, as you're mentioning the pin. It's very frustrating to deal with. So B3 and then having the option to move your queen wherever it so chooses to go is a good one. And for Dominguez, I mean, look at his time. He is down over 2 minutes in the clock. As you mentioned earlier, the position is cramped for black. What do we mean by that? Look at this knight on d7. Has nowhere good to go. Yes, it's looking at squares like e5 and c5, but the pawn on d4, a pawn 3 squares away from a knight, usually dominates that knight. And here that's the case. You can't go to c5. You can't ever go to e5. The knight on f6 is taking away a square from that knight on d7. Doesn't have anywhere to advance to. The bishop on e. Whoa!
That is a fancy move. It looks like the knight is hanging, e takes d5. But if white does play e takes d5 and c takes d5, then all of a sudden the knight on c4 that is pinned is going to be lost.
Yep.
And black is also closing up the position a little bit, making white's light squared fianchetto bishop more weak. And this looks fantastic. So I'm assuming that the right play for white is to just not take the knight on d5 and maybe even just move the bishop from f4 so that black doesn't take the bishop pair and also create some pawn structure issues for white.
Yeah, what a move by Dominguez, taking advantage, and there's that bishop retreat to d2, but taking advantage of that pinned piece. So there were tactics that made us move like knight to d5 acceptable. But then you must ask the question, okay, at first glance, that was a highlight reel move. And now that it's been played and the bishop retreats to d2, I mean, black's position, generally speaking, improves with some trades because you get more space for your pieces. But I still personally like white's pawn structure in the center and think that I would still take white even after that shocking knight d5 move.
Yeah, I agree. Finally, black is figuring out a way to develop his pieces, but still the position is very difficult. I like bishop f8. He's trying to reposition the bishop to g7 and fianchetto, or he's trying to just open up the e file. Probably a little bit of both since it's such a slow position to play.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because in some lines, e6 to e5 could be an option for black because there's a rook on e8, and that's why b3 stops all of that nonsense and protects the knight on c4. But there are some variations where, because there's a rook on e8 staring down at a heavier piece, a more important piece, a queen on e2, opening up the center of the board, even with potential sacrifices, could be possible. So knight goes into the b4 square. This is 2 games where we've seen a knight want to land on that square. The other was the Fabiano Caruana game. And this one is a very tense battle. Only one pawn has been traded in this entire game. I just like Adhiban's pawn center and his advantage of the clock. That's why I would prefer white's position.
Fair enough. Well, we finally have the game started between Jeffrey Xiong and Mamedyarov. So we can also take a look there since we've seen all the games so far.
Okay, and here we are. So what do we have here? One knight and one pawn have been traded. This, to me, looks like it should be a pretty level position. And do you think, let me ask you, Alexandra, do you think that Jeffrey Zhang, for his team's sake, they all just kind of want to neutralize Mamedyarov and be like, we're happy to make draws with him and beat up on the others?
That's a possible plan, but the other 2 boards have been performing better than Mamedyarov and Harikrishna in the league, so I'm not sure if that would even be the best strategy. Sure, if we're judging by this position, it seems like what Jeffrey Strong has gone for. He played an Indian game, which is much more solid for white, not the most aggressive opening to start off with.
Right. I mean, I'll just go back to the beginning. He went knight bd2 on the 3rd move. Not a standard opening to play, especially against compared to King's Indian or Grunfeld. But he got his center, and as we go back to the live board, he just, after rook takes d7, symmetrical pawn structure. Importantly, this pawn on c6 takes away the square d5. That's why Jeffrey went b4, both to stop the queen from getting to c5 and maybe play pawn b5 himself and try to use the d5 square. But I just believe in Mamedyarov's chances here. I think that not that he's better. I don't believe he's better. I would actually take white because I don't like the bishop on g7. It's kind of blocked in there by blocks on pieces, and the bishop on h4 can reroute to a square like f2, and white is the one who kind of controls the pawn breaks. But all that said, I think black is very solid. And Alexandra, I do want to take our attention away from this game to the Wesley So game, because there is a king on h5 that might get mated any moment now.
Yeah, there's definitely some checkmating possibilities there. White just played rook e3, suggesting he's looking towards the h3 square or the g3 square, which he just played to remove some of the space from black's king. So the black king cannot move on the g file. The pawn on f5 is hanging right now and helping open up the rook on d5's activity to lead to checkmate here.
And black's not even up anything for this, right? Like normally you have a king on h4, you're up like 2 pieces, but there's just a king on h4.
Yeah, this is looking pretty bad. I really like rook g7 and maybe For a second, I thought preparing g3 and rook h5 would be mate, but that would actually give the black king some space here.
Yeah, somehow the king would go into h3 and be safer. I think that if he wants it, he can just take on f6 and say, oh, he's just mating the king, isn't he? Rook h3 to h4 is checkmate. That's nice. That is not a checkmate you see every day, but you also typically don't see kings on g4 by super grandmasters.
That's true. And we have a resignation from Harikrishna here. Another tough game for him. It seems like he's continuing the streak of not playing as strong as his classical chess in the Pro Chess League. He's definitely going to need to step up the last 3 games if the Indian Yogis have a chance to defeat St. Louis.
Yeah, and I just, before we go to the other games, I want to point out that this was nice by Wesley So. I was just about to say that rook takes f6 is a free pawn, and the king's still on g4. White should be winning nonetheless. But it's good by Wesley, good vision that there's this king on g4. You should always look how many squares a king has remaining. In this case, the only square that it's safely attacking is the f5 square. And by playing rook to h5, you threaten rook 3 to h4, checkmating this poor king on g4. The only way to get out of it is a sacrifice of the bishop on h2, in which case you're just down a bishop. So nice win for Wesley So. Let's move on back to the other game. Let's go to that Fabiano game because we haven't been here for a while. And he is on the black side of this position against Narayanan. And Narayanan's holding his own here. I mean, I love the look of this bishop on d6, as well as this bishop on a6 looking absolutely terrible for the time being.
Yeah, I'd say he's doing more than just holding his own. I would prefer the white side of this position. As you mentioned, he has the bishop pair, and even though it's a close position right now, the two bishops have much more play than the black bishop on a6 and the knight on g5. The knight on g5 is looking towards the e4 square, definitely a good place for the knight. But after bishop takes e4, potentially f takes e4, then white is the one with more piece activity. It's interesting that Fabiano decided to keep his knight. Why do you think that is?
I think, as you mentioned, because the closed position, and if he went into this opposite colored bishop, well, maybe he just blundered a pawn. So I was going to say that there were opportunities there for white because the bishop on d6 was so much stronger, covering like a square like f8 and b8. The bishop on d6 is limited in scope because of this pawn on e5, but it is in a good square. And now f4 played, undermining the defense of the d4 pawn. We probably will see a bunch of liquidation here that allows Fabiano just to fizzle this game out into a drawish looking position. And f4 is very timely because otherwise the d5 pawn would have been lost too.
Yep. So he was able to trade off a pawn here. Black's king does look a little bit uncomfortable after a move like rook b7, but I suppose he can just escape king h6 and king h5. What do you think white's best chances for pushing for a win are in this position, if any?
I don't think his winning chances are that great just because there are so few pawns remaining. The e-pawn is passed, but it can't really go anywhere. And unlike Harikrishna's king, if this king gets to h5, it's actually helping lead black towards a mating net. Because imagine that king getting to g4 with that rook on c in the open file. That white king on the first rank could be vulnerable to some danger. So I do believe that ultimately this game, and I like king f2 as a starting move just to get the king out, but I do believe that this game is closer, if anything, to even than it is to any sort of advantage for white because the e-pawn can't push to e6 without some help. The bishop's on a dark square, e6 is a light square, which means you can never get around to helping that push. And the rook will probably come to c3 here to cut off the king. There it is. And rook d3, rook h3, both ideas. I think that black has enough play for sufficient compensation.
Fairly said. I guess on that note, we can check on how. Well, I'm looking between the last 2 games to see if it's worth moving or staying here.
You let me know. I'm always happy to go where you take us.
I guess we could look once again at the Adhiban and Leonard Dominguez Paris game.
Okay.
Because so bishop takes f8. I guess we're just doing some trades off. This position is also very level. Honestly, maybe even more so than the Fabiano game, even though there's more pieces on the board.
Yeah, because 5 pawns each, 2 minor pieces. But I do actually prefer black's position in this game slightly. And the reason why is that the king on g1 on the first rank has more trouble than this king on f8, which is ready to just jump into the center. So I with you, I think this game is very level. f4 opens up the king's path and attacks a knight there. But here, let's say bishop takes a4 is played. The rook on c3 is under attack. So you have to take on c8. I take back on c8. You take my bishop on a4. Now I have a knight against a bishop. And I'm not saying that's the most amazing thing in the world, but it's a bishop on a light square with nothing to attack. And a knight that can go from color complex to color complex. And it does appear to me that black should have the better chances of the endgame, even if it ultimately should just fizzle out and be quite an easy draw, more or less.
And bishop takes a4 was just played, so it seems like he's taking your advice on how to play this. But instead, he went for knight g4, which is interesting because it almost seems like he's going for knight e3 to trade off the knight, whereas we thought it'd be better for black to try to keep the knight. What about a move like, I was going to ask about h5 and trying something tricky to open it up. But it's not in black's interest to try to force for a win here. The St. Louis Archbishops already have a point here. He is playing with the black pieces. So do you think there's any pressure on Adhiban to try to force for a win here?
Yeah, he doesn't really have much to work with. That's the big issue. But if somehow he can get his rook in the 7th rank on d7 and try to become a bit more aggressive, that would be nice. The bishop on f3, though, doesn't have anywhere to operate from because you would love to get the bishop, say, to a score like b3 and then play move like f5 and rook d7 just to create a target, in this case, the f7 pawn. But that's such a far-fetched idea. It takes way too long to have it happen. And so here you see Dominguez put his knight on c4, rook on c1. He's getting active in the position in a way that white currently isn't.
Right. He's protecting his pawn on a5. His rook is a little bit more active. And both players have 30 seconds on the clock. So we might see some blunder here. It seems extremely unlikely, but at least the time situation makes this a bit more interesting.
Oh, absolutely. Like, imagine the move knight to d2 here. You see that in a game of blitz, and you're like, whoa, am I under some kind of attack? The knight's on a dark square, protected by a rook. He drops back to b6 to attack the a4 pawn. But here, I mean, there also should be plenty of ways for white to escape with a perpetual check, a repetition. So after rook b3, knight takes a4, you check on b8 and then check on b7. The king can't really go too far because the entire 7th rank, the pawns will fall. That said, you don't also want to give your opponent a passed a pawn to run with.
Yep. Well, black was able to get that extra a pawn, like you said, but white just found a perpetual. If the king tries to get closer, something like king d8, then the pawn on f7 is hanging, also allowing the one of the pawns g7 or h7 to fall. So I think we're gonna see the draw very soon.
Okay, so king to e8 played. What about king d7 now? Is that king just going to help the rook blockade on the c7 square? Let's start with rook a8. That's actually would be a nuisance for black. So they made a draw by repetition. I think more or less expected. Fair result here. And we have 2 games left. Let's go to the Caruana game just because the Mamedyarov one started a little bit later.
Definitely.
Whoa, wait. 2-on-1 here for Narayanan. And that's typically really bad news for the side down a pawn. Is Fabiano Caruana going to suffer a defeat here? So rook f6 check.
Yep.
Okay. But the pawn will.
Yeah, he doesn't want to take on g3 with the rook because after black takes on. Okay, now it looks like it's draw. She just lost his extra pawn.
Yeah, the rook can come to e3 once the pawn pushes and then capture it from behind, and then they'll just lose the g3 pawn, be rook against rook. But that was close because we were at a position, honestly, where if Fabiano was not quick to push this g-pawn, it would be just a bad endgame here. The 2 connected pass pawns with the rook can start pushing down the board, but unfortunately, now with threats of the rook a2 check, he had to move his rook away, and the king gobbled the d-pawn. Here we see a draw agreed. So a good start for Narayanan. He was the one who looked like he was pressing against Caruana, but Fabi ultimately held that one.
So we've had 2 draws so far, 1 win for Wesley So, and we're here looking at the last game of the match, which seems pretty even so far.
Yep.
I was going to say, if we're comparing the minor pieces here, it seems like white's pieces have a little bit more activity just because I'm looking at the knight on f5, looking towards e7. If the knight takes on f5, then we're going to take the bishop on c5 and keep the bishop pair. The bishop on c8 seems a little bit less active here, but I don't know if having slightly more active minor pieces in such an equal pawn endgame is going to make the difference.
Yeah, and I think Mamedyarov, he's smart to spend some time here to think, but I imagine bishop a6 check is a good inclusion. And the reason I say that is and he goes knight to b7. Aha. I'm a little, okay, the bishop on b3 is hanging. I was very confused for a second here because I'm like, isn't bishop c5 removing the defender of the e7 square, which is check, and hitting the bishop? But after a move like king f8, knight takes bishop on c8, the knight will take on b3, and we have had a big trade of things here in a symmetrical and pretty ugly pawn structure for both sides in the ensuing knight endgame.
Yep. So bishop takes f5 instead here. He's trading off the bishop for the knight here. How do you pick between e takes f5 and g takes f5 here?
It's a great question. Either capture opens a square for your king because your king's not just going to sit on f1. It wants to enter the game. It wants to advance to better squares. And if you take with the g pawn, the king will come to h3 perhaps and come to g4 at some moment and try to slither its way in. But it takes the e pawn, which I think makes more sense, freeing up the square e4 for either the bishop or you would like the king. But unfortunately, yeah, now the knight's in c5. You're not getting either piece there, at least not without repercussions. So I think that ultimately black has a kind of a fortress here and can't lose.
Right. Because the furthest the white king can advance to right now seems like c4. At least if he'd be able to advance to c4 now, he'd be putting some pressure on the knight. But now, okay, we have an opposite color bishop ending. So even if white gets that extra pawn, the black king will be able to just hold the c3 pawn from being able to promote in the future, and the black bishop can help defend all of the pawns. The white king isn't going to make it through, so it seems like they're going to agree to draw very soon.
They certainly will, and the king c5 is a nice move. You just do not want to allow the white king to get active. If you look at the pawns that are potentially weak, the f6 one, the a5 pawn, the king can't possibly get to the f6 pawn. Right? There's no space on the king side to do anything. So sitting your king on c5 is just a clear fortress. You move your bishop back and forth for the rest of the game. You don't need to move any other pieces, and white cannot do anything of note. So they agree for a draw. That means St. Louis wins the first round 2.5, 1.5. So Alexandra, before we take our first break of the day, anything surprising by that first round or more or less in line with what you expected?
It's in line with what I expected because I thought that the match would be closer than it seems from playing the powerhouse team St. Louis. And a big question was whether we would see the top two players of the Indian Yogis being able to play more at their level, since it has been a very difficult Pro Chess League for Harikrishna. We saw that for Mamedyarov, not yet for Harikrishna, but hey, we have 3 more matches, so maybe that can change.
I'm with you, and Harikrishna will get the white pieces in the next game, so hopefully he can play a better opening. We were both feeling very skeptical about how that opening went for him, and it turned into a very, honestly, brutal defeat. But before we get to know what happens next, we will take a short break and be back with this quarterfinal matchup of the 2020 Pro Chess League playoffs.
chess capital of Europe. Meet and greet and simul with Magnus Carlsen. It's the Pro Chess League Finals at Chess Party 2020. Caruana, So, Botez, Hammer, Rudolph, Chess Bras, an open Fisher Random Chess Tournament. Will you be part of the world's biggest chess party?
And we are back, about to cover the second round of this quarterfinal matchup between the India Yogis and the St. Louis Archbishops. Alexandra, you found that the first round was more or less how you expected it to go. I mean, the question I have to ask, and we keep sort of hinting at, is can Harikrishna score some points in the Pro Chess League?
That's the big question, Robert. And maybe he hasn't been able to until now. I can't think of a better time for him to step up and put on the shoes his team expects for him in this role than this game that would help them make the playoffs.
Do you think that he needs to have his eureka moment?
That's a fantastic question. And if you guys haven't heard our question of the day just yet, it is what was your eureka moment that helped you understand chess at a deeper level? If you have an answer for that, tweet with #ProChess and we might feature you on the screen towards the second half of this match.
Yep. And it's funny because for Harikrishna, we're making some jokes, but on a serious note, like he just needs to get it together. He has 3 rounds left in this match. He's getting the white pieces against Jeffrey Zhang. I think that's a good matchup for him on paper. Jeffrey is super talented. He's played very well in his over-the-board events. It is a great player in the online format. But I do believe, finally getting the white pieces in this match. You had a tough one against Wesley So, who's difficult no matter what format, what day. I do believe that Harikrishna needs to make his mark right now, or else the India Yogis are going to be in deep trouble.
Great point, Robert. And I'm seeing some funny comments from our viewers. Somebody said, LOL, I'm still waiting for my eureka moment. Well, hopefully it's going to come one of these days. Harikrishna is waiting also. We have Fabiano Caruana starting off with an English against Adhiban. Whenever we see top players starting off with an English as the white pieces, what comes to mind, Robert?
For Fabiano Caruana, what comes to mind is a very strong preparation, because I've been able to witness his openings firsthand at various tournaments, including Isle of Man in 2019, and then in Vaikonze, which he won in dominant fashion at the beginning of this year in January. So this line in particular is a very interesting combative one, because you note that the knight is on d5, which is attacking the bishop, but in many ways, Black wants that bishop to be captured. If we take on b4, a takes b4, the rook on a8 is a much better piece than the rook on a1. The rook on a1 is protecting a pawn on a2. The rook on a8 is attacking said pawn, has more space to operate with. And in a closed position, you don't really mind ceding the bishop pair to white.
Right. And in the current position, white played a3. We have the pawn on a5. Sometimes in positions like this, you see Black making a move like a4 so that b4 isn't possible in the future because we're able to take with en passant. Is this a position where Black should consider that move sooner rather than later?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're not going to get that opportunity because of how Fabiano played this with his knight on c3, queen on d1, eyeing that square. But it's a very important idea to keep in mind, say, if this knight were to be traded away from c3, and that way, as you said, you kind of cement White's pawn structure, prevent this b4 push. I guess for Adhiban, he's not too concerned about b4 for the time being. He does have some flexibility on the queen side, but we ask this question a lot, Alexandra. What is going to happen to this bishop on c8?
That has been a common question in the match so far. It looks like Black can go for either moving the knight from d7 to another square to free the bishop, but there's not too many good options, or eventually pushing the b pawn and playing bishop b7. I think for right now, the bishop is just going to stay where it is on c8. and
Yeah, you're
maybe just go for e4 or a pawn push in the center first before developing his light squared bishop here.
Yeah, because you would on one hand want to play knight f8 and then get your bishop out, but if you move knight f8, you just drop a pawn because d takes e5, d takes e5. The rook currently protects the pawn e5, but not after queen takes queen, distracting the rook away, and then you lose the pawn e5. So when queens are in the same line and there is pawn tension in the center, you always want to consider what happens to your remaining pieces once that trade happens. So in this case, the knight cannot move from d7. Bishop b8 played to say, hey, wait a second. Not only am I protecting this pawn on e5 another time, but imagine if I play this e4 push and then followed up with d5. My bishop on b8 stares all the way down at the pawn on h2 and can give Adhiban, the beast, some attacking chances.
Fair enough. Well, that dark squared bishop has moved several times already, and we're just on move 12. You usually don't recommend plans like that for people who are pretty new to chess. Obviously, Adhiban does not fall in that category, but it's interesting that he spent so many tempi only to end up with his bishop on b8 on the back rank. But that being said, it's still going to be an active piece if he's able to open up the center, like you pointed out.
For sure. And you're right to point that out too, that bishop b4, bishop c5, bishop a7, bishop b8 is not your typical journey for a dark square bishop, but it does look pretty decent on that square right now. E4 at some moment, perhaps now, is looking pretty tempting, at least to me. And once you get e4 in, where's this knight going to go? If it goes to d2, not only am I looking at the h2 pawn with ideas, I'm also looking at the c4 pawn because knight e5 comes with the tempo in many variations of attacking that pawn. But you have to be very careful before you push e4 because that pawn can't move back. You're in danger of overextending, and you, of course, do not want to lose that one. But maybe this bishop will come to e5 instead, pinning this knight on c3 and going queen c7. So it's a really interesting dynamic here where neither side particularly wants to rush things. And here's queen e7 proving that point.
Well, we talked a lot about what Black's plan is in this position. We didn't talk so much about White. White has the space advantage on the queen side here. So if he wants to play on any side, it's definitely going to be on the queen side. Maybe ideas like c5 to get even more space and potentially reposition the f3 knight to c4 and try to hop into the weak dark squares for Black. But I don't see any very scary break or plan on the queen side here for White.
Yeah, I don't either. And if you play c5, as you point out, you're controlling the d6 and the b6 squares, but Black might play b6 himself right away, saying, I'm going to chisel at your pawn structure. If you let me, I'm going to take that pawn for free. And behind that pawn on c5 is a hanging pawn on b4. So Black actually can counter so quickly on the queen side that I'm not sure it's worth it for White to play c5. But if you don't play c5, what are you going to do about this pawn on b4? Not to mention e4, queen e5 type threats, lining the bishop and the queen against the h2 pawn.
Right. So it seemed like his best option was just to push here. And here we're going to see if he tries to defend the pawn on c5 with one of his knights or if he decides to take on b6. It seems like if he takes on b6, he is really just going to create some pawn weaknesses in the future. The b4 pawn is still going to be difficult to defend even here. It just has the same question you asked before. What are we going to do about that b pawn? A move like queen b1 is just going to be met by e4. But even with your plan of e4, is it that devastating for White?
I don't know if I would say it's devastating, at least not yet, but it's going to force White to create weaknesses on the king side because anytime you can get, I mean, even if you didn't take back on b6 right away, but just to put a position on the board, like a queen e5 type of move, you have to play g3 and then look at all your light squares, f3, h3. This bishop would like to jump over the knight into the action, which is why as in the game continuation, starting with knight takes b6 opens up that bishop's access in the diagonal. And knight e4 played, okay, the b4 pawn is still can be captured, and if anyone's better, it's definitely Black.
Well, I think we can also check out the Mamedyarov and Wesley So game because it looks really exciting right now. Wesley So just captured a rook on a1. the white king is on f2. Black hasn't managed to castle yet. I know it's a silly question, but to get into a position like this, I almost think maybe it must have been theory or something like that.
It's starting to look that way. And their last couple moves, if we go back to move 12, was let's even go back and move further to 11. Knight to b4 was played, hitting this knight on d5, which on the great square. And after queen f3, there's where the rook was lost on a1. But after taking on f6 and go back to e8, you can take this knight on a1. But I guess Mamedyarov was saying, well, my king is on f2. It's pretty weak as well. And I only would have one pawn and a knight. Actually, you would just have a knight for a rook. So the material would be a deficit, and that's why he's giving these checks. But you know that he's just calculating, can I get away with knight takes a1 and play an exchange down when this king can't castle and will be in the center for a while?
Right. It's totally up to him now if he wants to go for the perpetual or try to play for a win here. Do you think he should take his team's score so far into account as he makes this decision?
I would take the current games in addition to the score into account, because you don't want to try to force a win and then lose the game if everybody else is saying, let's say, makes a draw. So I do think that Mamedyarov, of course, wants to win. He's got the white pieces. But if Wesley played some line that now is up a full rook and maybe even just an exchange and not the clearest way to push forward for white, then knight f6 check, knight d5, just making the repetition would be very logical. And he has 4 minutes of 40 seconds. So I would spend most of that time looking at my teammates' boards and then, if nothing else, bail out with this draw.
Fair enough. Speaking of his teammates, I'm looking at the game between Harikrishna and Jeffrey Xiong. We have a position that came out of the Scandinavians, so the black queen is really active.
It certainly is, but Anna's stolen the pawn on d4, but the black king is still in the center. So, Alexandra, your gut, what's it telling you? Is black going to be okay here, or is white going to crash through?
Well, I guess in a position like this, it's more based on actually calculating a bit than just my gut. I guess white is going to be okay here just because white's pieces are placed so well. I was about to say, I don't know about trading off the queens, because if black is up a pawn, then usually you don't want to liquidate that to an ending unless there is some concrete line you saw here. And again, we really need Harikrishna to start getting some wins here, some results for his team. Are there any tactical motives you see here that may have justified trading off the queens and going into an ending so soon?
I guess he felt he couldn't afford to keep the queens on the board with the black's queen being so active. And I was about to say that the bishop on e4, if we just go back a move here, it couldn't go to d5 because pawn c4 traps that bishop. And so in order to not lose a full piece, you'd have to play like f6 and try to kick the knight. But all these lines are really, really bad for black, as I could choose which pawn to take, either e6 or c6, and then the whole pawn structure completely collapses. So here he plays bishop g6, but after h4, with the threat of h5, you have to move one of your pawns to save this bishop. And if you move the f pawn, you lose control of the e6 square. So I'll take your bishop on g6 and then take on e6. And if you play h6, the same, or h5, the same thing happens where I take your bishop on g6 and your e6 pawn falls. So I guess Jeffrey, is up a pawn now, but he's going to have to give it back with interest.
Yeah, definitely. Can he try a move like knight d5 to try to block the bishop's diagonal and continue with f6 right after h5 to put pressure on the knight?
So after h5, it looks like your bishop's trapped, but you're going to play f6. Then you might get a crazy knight. For starters, I can take on g6 my pawn, but I can also consider knight takes c6 and just say, if you take me on c6, then I take on g6, and your e6 pawn is under attack. So the material equality is restored, but black's position is quite fragile. And if not for that, I do think they played a5. So he's trying to trap white's bishop on the other side of the board. But I don't believe in this, Alexandra. I mean, h5 here is probably what's good for white, because a4 can be met by hg6. And if you take back on g6, then I move my bishop to c4. it's a square protected by the knight. And if you take on b3, I take on f7 with check, and then take on b3, and then white goes up a pawn with a better structure remaining.
Hey, it looks like we are gonna see the win for Harikrishna in this game. I see a result in Mamedyarov and Wesley So. They did agree to draw, so it seems like he went for the perpetual. And I'm getting note in chat that Adhiban made a blunder in his game against Fabiano.
Uh-oh.
So maybe we should take a look there.
Brought it back up here, and oh no, I see exactly what happened. His bishop on b8 is not defended, and so if he takes with the pawn on d5 here, he loses his knight. If he takes with the knight on d5, he loses his bishop on b8, and oh, that was so unnecessary. And he is going to get the rook on f1, but it's too little, too late. So just to go back here, see what happened.
Mm-hmm.
He took on b4. He was up a pawn, and then he went knight b4 to d5. Just a clear oversight that the bishop could simply capture on d5, and now either you lose the bishop on b8 or the knight on b6. So that's very sad for the India Yogis. And, well, Adhiban will try his best to hold the ensuing endgame with the imbalance of rook for black versus two minor pieces for white.
Yeah, he's going to try to hold, but that is not going to be an easy task, especially against world number 2 here. So we'll let him try to fight that and check out the last game we haven't seen yet between LDP and Narayanan.
I love it. LDP, saying it's not just going to be the Frenchman who gets 3 names. Lanier will also get the LDP.
Yeah, I hope that's okay. Well, speaking of LDP, I really like his position here. G5 is such a tempting move. You can't not want to play it in this position.
For sure. I mean, G5 blasting open the king side. I guess both kings are, I don't want to call the white's king weak, but it's a bit open. There's a bit of a breeze out there in front of it. And Narayanan right now, if he can play queen to b6 to trade queens, but I think this is a mistake many people make. They think if we trade queens, then the king is immediately safe. Not in this position. If you play queen b6, I simply take on f6 with threat of rook to g7 check. So I'm happy to trade queens as the black king is very weak.
Yeah, so no, I'm just trying to figure out what black can do to try to defend in this position.
I think ultimately some sort of queen trade will have to happen. For instance, queen a7 looks like a move that is very tempting to me because you're threatening the c7 pawn in addition to trying to capture on f6 and open up the g file. But if queen b6 check and we trade and you take on f6, maybe this isn't the end of the world for black. The king can take on f6 and there will certainly be counterplay. The pawn on c2 is under attack. The rook is threatening to go to d2. The other rook is on an open h file. The king maybe can snake into a square like e5, but it looks, I mean, rook g6 check, for instance, is already looking super suspicious as king e5 is met by rook e6 checkmate. And knight on e2 takes away the squares. So, this looks not good to me.
Yeah. I guess after queen a7, is there any way black could get rook d2 fast enough? No, because there's just too many weaknesses in black's position, like you pointed out here.
Yeah, if there is some sort of saving grace where you can attack this queen some more and get a tactic going, then that would be excellent. But it just feels, it kind of feels bad, man. If I'm being honest with you, just
yeah,
these rooks are lined up so nicely on the g file.
They certainly are, and there's no way that black can avoid the g file opening up in this position, which is what makes the position so hard. Maybe, I don't think this is time yet, but sometimes when you're in a bad position, you try to go for some type of desperado, something like rook d2, and create some counterplay. But I think if you play rook d2, then you just have queen takes c7, and you're going to get checkmated if you don't retreat your rook.
Hey, you inspired me, by the way. Maybe f takes g5 is possible because you start talking about desperados and ways to get to the white king and things like that. If you take on g5 with the rook, then I have rook h2 check. And so you're giving me access to the second rank. And if you play queen takes c7, I have this rook block with rook d7. And hey, the king on f7 is still open and exposed, but the king on f2 is also in a bit of danger. So I think perhaps Narayanan has to take this pawn on g5, giving up the c7 pawn with the check, but rook d7 covers the seventh rank and play continues.
That's a great find there. Let's see if Narayanan can also find this line you just played. And it's good to see some Chess.com members who are trying to guess alongside the game. I'm not sure if we're doing guess the move today, but even if we aren't, it's a great way to try to put yourself in the shoes of these players. And we are doing guess the move. So if you guys want to try to guess along, go to chess.com and follow the games. Try to put the move you think the players are going to make, and we have a $50 prize for the person who makes the most correct guesses.
Yep, and I see Dragon B70 out there guessing away, trying to win another guess the move. And Alexandra, I don't like what Narayanan did because he went rook d2 just to go back to d7. He could have the same position with the black pawn on g5 instead of the white pawn here. So I feel like this was a mistake. I still think it's very complicated, but I do believe f takes g5 was the better plan. And I want to take our attention very quickly here to a different game because Harikrishna said he needs to win a game, to get back on track. And as we see his game right now against Jeffrey Zhang, well, he's up in exchange and just dominating.
Yep. And when you're up in exchange in games like this, what is usually the plan for the side down in material to try to hold a draw?
Unfortunately, this particular one might be a bit beyond hope, but in general, just survive. It sounds kind of obvious in the sense surviving as long as possible gives you the best chances, but you have to pinpoint your opponent's weaknesses. And here, that would be a b3 pawn, but now that white has stolen a pawn, in addition to the exchange, white's up too much material. But yeah, there's just no counterplay. You need to figure out where to go against your opponent, where the points of vulnerability are. There just are none when you're down so much material here.
Yep, that's a good point. Black's not just down in exchange, but about to lose the rest of the pawns as well. So just a very hopeless position, but he's still trying some last tricks, trying to set up some potential checkmates on the back rank. Unfortunately, moves like rook f7 could probably just stop any threats the black king has.
Yeah, you'd have to get your black king into a square like f3, which takes some time, and rook f7 takes f4 at some moment could be sufficient because you are up two queenside pawns. That said, you don't want to get complacent and say, oh, I'm up two pawns, I'll win the game, because the black king will still be very active and be a nuisance in the position. But Harikrishna, he's doing what he needs to. Fabiano Caruana has officially won that game where Adhiban blundered earlier. So that's good news for the archbishops. And we have 2 games remaining in this round.
Yep. And it seems like the Jeffrey game is going to end in a win for St. Louis. So the match is tied looking in at this last game with LDP here, who seems to be winning. So yet again, St. Louis is going to win by a 1-point margin.
Yeah, so we think that Harikrishna will score one for India, and then Dominguez, if he can win this game, which then knight on f4 is heading into a square like G or E6 with rook G7 check ideas as well, it does look like a menacing attack for him. But I'm not so sure. This king is going to escape E8 and the king on f2. I mentioned it so many times earlier, but the king on f2 really isn't that safe. Like rook h2 check ideas, and the rooks are being disconnected from each other. The king would have to go G3. 7 seconds left for white. This is an exciting finish here between Dominguez and Narayanan.
True. Is rook h2 offering some perpetual hopes for black? I guess rook h2 and rook g1.
Okay, so
it just doesn't work because you trade off and then black's up a pawn.
Right. So trading material is, as you're pointing out, is bad for white because you only have a knight and that pawn on e6. You can't checkmate with that configuration. But I think rook d2 here for black, and you have rook e3 check ideas. I don't think that the white king is any safer than the black king. And black gives up that outside pass pawn. So if the game continues, especially with 6 seconds left, 5 seconds, this is really tough for white. And he sees no bailout. That's a big problem. Okay, king f3, there's rook e3 check. Where's that king going? Oh my gosh. So it's escape for now, but it can't move anymore. Rook g2 check, that rook is protected.
Yeah, for a second, it looked really dangerous. Well, rook g2 and king f4 and trading off the rooks, does that give black winning chances?
Slight winning chances, not that much material remaining. So I think that white will hold this game.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because where's the king on e8 really going? It just, this is not as nearly as good. I switched games back then, but just checking that game. It looks not nearly as good for Dominguez as they did earlier because it is Narayanan who's up a pawn and hoping to get this a pawn rolling. So Harikrishna just officially won that game. So the Yogis have so far split this second round of action 1.5, and we're left here. Dominguez with 8 seconds, Narayanan with 55 seconds counting down.
Wow. Well, this is a much spicier finish than we expected when we saw the position earlier. Now it's just equal material. White was able to get a pawn back. So it looks like it's going to end in a draw. Nice tied match for the Yogis here.
And 93.
Tied game, sorry.
Trying to just take this pawn on f5, because if you take the pawn f5, even if you sacrifice your knight in the process. 2 seconds, 1 second. What's Dominguez doing?
Oh no!
Oh my gosh! Dominguez just lost some time.
Oh man! Can we get a reaction from LDP? I mean, we can only see the top half of his face, and it's still not moving, much like his time.
What just happened? Was his connection bad? I really wasn't looking at the connection bar. But
it seemed like his connection. Oh no! He noticed.
Yeah, that's not good news. That must be a connection issue. He must have lagged out. But either way, Narayanan deserves immense credit for his defensive technique in this game. It looked like he was really on the ropes, and he probably was objectively. But he hung around long enough to survive. Then he went up a pawn. Dominguez had just seconds waning. And finally, it was Narayanan who, maybe it was fortuitous, he won on time, but he's even the match thanks to his victory and Harikrishna's victory.
You've been so good at predicting these matches. I mean, it's still really early, but it's just such a treat to have a tied match so far.
Yeah, it's a shocking turn of events because I'm starting to believe in your prediction even more based on the trajectory of these games. If it's going to be a 2-2 tie, I was going to say St. Louis by 2 at the end of the match sounds about right. Now we have an even score. Adhiban must be the most relieved because he had a great position against the world number 2 before botching it. And so we have a tied matchup. I need to catch my breath because I'm just misspeaking all over the place with how exciting these games are. Alexandra and I will be back after this short break.
premium membership at Chess.com will help you improve your game with full access to a powerful set of learning tools. Unlimited tactics let you practice like a master, with more than 50,000 puzzles to challenge you at every level. Our library of interactive chess lessons, created by master coaches, will enhance every aspect of your game. And after each game you play, the computer analysis feature will give you feedback on every move you played, turning every game into a chance to learn. And that's not all. Premium benefits also include unlimited tournaments, video lessons, the Opening Explorer, and much, much more. Upgrade now to take your game to the next level.
And we've come back with some responses to our daily question, which was, what was your eureka moment that helped you to understand chess on a deeper level? Alexandra, want to take this first one here?
Yeah, let's see the first response from Greenie. When I realized tactics were a thing and the themes had names. Wow, that was a very articulate way of answering the question here. I guess for people who are new to chess, starting to learn tactics is definitely helpful.
I do believe also that having the names for things is very helpful because it gives you something to point to rather than just this random aberration that happens. You can be like, oh, yeah, I remember I learned about this scholar's mate or what have you. But Bella Niche 11 says, the day I came to know that promotion of a pawn is not limited to the queen only. That's a good one. Under promotion is a thing.
Llama to B9 says, when I realize that simply attacking undefended stuff is generally good to do. I guess tempo and initiative are important or something.
I think that has some importance, yes. But I'm enjoying these responses to the daily questions because everyone has really these different moments that help them understand the game better, whether it's the names to different ideas or figuring out a new rule that you didn't know before, like you can not promote to a queen if you don't want to. Some of the people in the Pro Chess League could have benefited from that one, right, Alexandra?
That's for sure. I mean, learning how to promote to something that's not a queen and which key to hold down has actually helped influence the results in the league.
Yep, indeed. And we're going to have the games going any moment now. It is a tied matchup. So, Alexandra, do you want to change your prediction? Are you still happy with the 9-7 guess?
I'm not going to change my prediction. I would be happier if yours were to come true. Everybody likes getting into the tie breaks. And hey, Harikrishna finally got a win. Is he going to be able to get another win against Fabiano? It seems like he has double whites. Yep. So he had a white against Jeffrey Chong, and now he has another white. Let's see him scoring some points for his team.
He gets the double white sandwich in black in rounds 1 and 4. So bookends with the blacks. He unfortunately lost his first round with the black piece against Wesley So, but then he won a nice game there against Jeffrey Zhang. And here with the white pieces, playing a very classical, calm setup where no pawns have been traded, no pieces have been traded, and Fabiano has rerouted his knight from the king side over here to d7 and probably to the square c5, which allows black as well to push f5 if he so chooses.
And white has the very typical setup with c3. He can put his bishop back on c2 if he wants. The c3 pawn is going to help support the d4 pawn push in the future, grabbing some of the center control there.
Yep. And he chooses bishop b3 as a landing point, preventing f5 for the time being, which is why Fabiano ran his king over to h8. And king h8 is nice when you're trying to play f5 and maybe launch pawns on the king side. But the problem is that in endgames, you'd rather your king be closer to the center than in the corner. And I know an endgame, a true endgame, is very far away from now, but just something to keep in the back of your mind.
Yep, and it's interesting that you're bringing up the endgame in positions like this. Would you say it's a useful tool for trying to shape what your plan is going to be, even this early on in the first 11 moves?
Absolutely, especially when you see this tension on d4 and e5, because if white were to get a free move here, d takes e5 could be that move, which allows you to trade queens at the end of the variation. So I'm thinking about the possible plans for each side, and Fabiano takes on d4 and might be playing f5 for himself still. Now this king's on h8, but I do think that I would be more likely to trade off into an endgame as white with the king on h8 because it is, it's more distant from the action.
All right, and we've had some trades. So now white has an isolated pawn on d4. It's also a pawn that is helping give white more space in the center. We know that those are the trade-offs with having any type of isolated queen's pawn position here. What would you say the general plan is for trying to play alongside an isolated pawn and trying to use it to your advantage?
Well, you want your rooks on those semi or open files. So when you have an isolated pawn, you have the adjacent files inherently are open to your pieces. So here's the E file and the C file. So I would like to get my rook to the C1 square, but the bishop on C1 doesn't have a clear landing point just yet, and bishop C2 first just eyes at this king side. There are not too many black pieces over there defending the king, so it does look like Harikrishna is going for the very thematic setup: pawn a3, queen d3, try to threaten checkmate on h7. But Fabiano is ready for that and will play g6 and even put his bishop back to g7.
Well, that sounds like a great plan for this game. I did a little switcheroo and I'm looking at the game between Mamedyarov and LDP. They've already traded off queens. The white king is in a vulnerable position, but he's lucky because there is no queen on the board anymore. He just played rook d5, which seems like it would hold against a move like bishop f5, where black is able to develop his bishop with the tempo and prepare to bring the rooks in on the c file as well. My question for you is, even though we got the queens traded off, does black still have attacking chances here?
Absolutely. I actually don't like white's position here at all. And the king has joined the party. And shout out to Chess Party 2020, which is what the Pro Chess League is presented by. And there will be the finals, of course, in Norway. But the king doesn't want to be in the mix of things here. The king's on c2. It's in the open. You point out bishop f5 ideas. Even if not bishop f5, let's say bishop e6, a5, a4, which you want to play anyway to try to promote this passed pawn of yours, you get a bishop b3 check type of maneuver. It feels like white is all out of sorts here. And the one good thing I would say is that you have control over some of the vital squares, like a knight can come to d4 at any moment. If you're a couple moves away from playing bishop d3 and bring your other rook into the game, but something about this feels very sketchy for white.
Well, interesting comment from Grandmaster Georg Meyer, who is saying that this is theory. It seems like he plays this as white, and he's always thought it's a pleasant position. So it's interesting to see his perspective as somebody who is experienced with this line.
Yeah, I mean, the knight will come to d4. Of course, that makes perfect sense. And what white in many ways trying to go for is to create a pawn on d4 to replace that knight and then try to advance those pawns. But I've never really been a huge believer in this position for white, just precisely because of the king on c2. It doesn't feel like it's particularly well placed. And Dominguez is the type of solid player that I believe can handle these positions well. But you have to give Georg a shout out because he's just saying he studied these lines. He knows what's going on here, and well, I'm not as familiar with them. So shout out to Georg. He's incredibly strong in positions just like this. And well, if I were playing Georg in this position with either color, I don't like my chances.
Well, I guess we'll see how this game is continuing from here. Should we take a look as well at the Wesley So and Narayanan game?
Let's do it. Let us go.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say it's a little bit less crazy than the positions we've been looking at, even if they are theoretical. We got a pawn on e5 for black, nice central pawn, while Wesley only has his pawn on d3 so far, but his knight is on e4, so controlling a lot of the center squares here. I guess now d takes e4 is going to get a lot more symmetrical. If we're looking at the minor pieces in this position, I actually prefer black's for now because his pawn on e5 isn't in the way of his bishop, but I guess after rook e3, rook a d1, just a very solid, safe position for both sides here.
Yeah, I think that the pawn structure is a bit more favorable for white on the queen side. And the reason I say that is because the c3 pawn controls the knight on c6. We say this time and time again. A pawn 3 squares away from a knight often dominates that piece. And then knight on c6, well, it's totally fine there. The pawn says you're not getting to b4, and you're certainly not getting to d4. And meanwhile, Wesley reroutes his knight from f3 over towards the queen side. And you can play for b4 if you want. You can play knight to c4 right away. But now black is ready to play bishop c5 and trade bishops rather than giving up the bishop for the knight. So I like the way Narayanan's playing, and he's also up on the clock.
Yeah, that's a good tidbit to point out there. How would you rank Wesley So's abilities to play in time pressure?
Oh, he's a monster. We've seen that in many speed chess championships, so not too concerned about him. He has plenty of time left in the clock, considering what kind of position it is. Relatively quiet. So we're getting word, that, at least in the chat, that Mamedyarov blundered into a trap. So let us go back to that game of Mamedyarov versus Dominguez, because there's this king is being hunted. At least that's what it looks like to me and to our chatters. Thank you for drawing our attention here. The king, I can't get behind this king.
You're right. And we looked at it earlier and we said it seemed, a little bit tricky for White's king. And it seemed that Black was actually able to infiltrate. Now he has the rook on c1, pinning the bishop on f1. Maybe a move like bishop f5 here looks really good, because then we're also looking towards the c2 square. The rook on f8 is going to be able to go to c8 and double up, or d8 in the future. There's a lot of good moves for Black here. So I guess the question is, how did White step into this position? What was the mistake?
Well, we just go back a couple moves with knight d4 was played. The knight captured on d4, and Mamedyarov took with the c pawn rather than the e pawn. And it makes sense that you want your nice center with pass pawns on the e and d files. And the problem, of course, was the c8 square, and the check on the c file is disastrous. But he could have just captured back with the e pawn and played this endgame that Georg Meyer seemed to be a fan of.
Well, LDP is definitely trying to make up for that flag in the last game, and it seems like he is, by almost taking down the top board for the Yogis.
Just the position looks so good. The rook on c1 pins this bishop on f1 to the rook on h1. Rook c8 threatens rook c2 checkmate. So this king isn't exactly in a very happy spot. Though that said, the bishop on a3 is under attack. So if you are able to parry off the checkmate threat with like e4, and then the bishop on a3 is in trouble, you might come to regret certain things like this. But ultimately, Black, just with a couple precise moves, should be able to maybe not land a knockout blow just yet, but increase the advantage that he has already accrued.
Certainly. So I think we can see how LDP is going to continue here, and if he finishes off those finalizing moves here.
Oh, and we'll keep an eye on this game, but I want to see the Jeffrey Jean game against Adhiban, because just like this one, there seems to be a king that could become in some trouble. And we see a king on g1 with an open g file, and Black is currently down a piece. But in order to safeguard this king, you want to take on f4 here. But if you take on f4, there's queen c5 check, scooping up this knight on a5. So even material will be on the board, but the king on g1, which will go to h1, will be much less safe than the king on g8. So let's see how we got here just a couple moves ago, because clearly there was a piece sack, and it came with knight f4.
Knight f4, what a nice move. He definitely must have calculated that one ahead of time. It's nice that he was using the knight being so far on the rim, unprotected, and that check threat to come up with that tactical motive. Now we have Black putting pressure on the d3 bishop. Maybe, so the white bishop needs to move now. A move like queen e2 is also an option, but it feels like trades would be good for White here, since White's king is in the more dangerous position, so he might feel a little relieved to get the rooks off the board. Instead, he goes for queen h4. Okay.
Yeah, and he's hoping for rook takes d3, queen takes d8 check, rook takes d8, rook takes d8 check. Only move to block the check is bishop f8, and after bishop f8, there's bishop h6. Very thematic, trying to deliver a checkmate on f8. the best black would be able to do is sacrifice the queen, but then you'd be down material in the ensuing position. So unfortunately for Adhiban, he cannot just steal this bishop on d3. He's blundered a piece in his previous game, but he's not going to blunder with rook takes d3 in this one.
Right. So let's say black makes a quiet move here, something like bishop e6. What is white's plan to continue here?
It's a good question. I mean, black's just better. Perhaps now this bishop c2 or bishop e2 maneuver to trade off some of the pieces, but a2 is also hanging, so even the end of some of these lines are not comfortable for white because the queen side is so vulnerable. You do have to be careful not to blunder things like that queen takes d8 idea that we just talked about, but it has the look of a position that with just some accuracy, Jeffrey Zhang should be in big trouble.
Yeah. And Jeffrey Zhang, yeah, he is. I was about to say he has been struggling this match. He has 0.5 so far in the first two. If he ends up losing this game as well, he might be one of the reasons why the St. Louis team isn't winning the match and so close.
Yep. So bishop e3 played, and that blocks the check, hits the queen.
But what about queen takes b2 here? And then if the queen takes on h3, we can grab the rook on d3, and it looks like all of white's queenside pawns are just struggling.
But there's the same issue, though, with queen c8 check, bishop f8, bishop h6. But actually, maybe now you just play queen to a3, protect the bishop. And even though it doesn't look so nice for black, you're just a couple moves away from playing queen to e7, rook to d8, and cutting off the queen on the back rank. And all of white's pawns are hanging in this position as well. So if you can get away with it, go for it. But it is a bit of a risk that I'm sure Adhiban will take very seriously.
Certainly. I'm taking a look at the other games. Harikrishna and Fabiano's position looks pretty level.
Okay, let's go over there. So we're going to switch games to Harikrishna and Caruana. Level position with even material, both sides with a rook and a minor piece and 6 pawns. I like that move, rook b7. It just looks uncomfortable for black.
It looks uncomfortable for black, but it also feels like the rook is a little trapped itself. I guess moves like d6 could always help the rook just trade off here if he wants.
Yeah, I mean, that way you give up the d pawn for the c pawn. What black really wants to do is somehow attack this pawn on d5 and go for it. So bishop b3 to take on d5, saying, I'll give you my bishop for your knight, and then we'll trade the d for c pawns. That should fizzle out. So I do agree with you. It's looking quite level. I'm trying to figure out if there's anything that this knight can do to be of use. But for the time being, Harikrishna is just going pawn hunting. He
certainly is. Bishop d3, good way to protect the pawn on e6 and also take away the f1 square. Although the king would probably play something like king g2 or f3, king f2 to try and bring his king into the endgame here. Wow, yep. Knight a4. So knight a4 threatening knight takes b6. How can black try and protect this pawn? I like that he's just using tactics here to try and grab a pawn on the queen side, and he's not even worried about bringing in his king just yet because he can do it with just the rook and the knight.
Yeah, because knight takes b6 is taking advantage of the fact that the rook is under attack. It's not protected, but bishop b5 will attack this knight on a4 while protecting the rook on d7. So bishop b5 would force this knight to retreat, say, back to c3, and no danger for black here.
And that's just what happened. And now all of black's queenside pawns are protected. Do you think black should try to go for some type of pawn exchanges on the king side, maybe a move like f5?
The problem with playing f5 is that, while you are making some advances, you also have these double g pawns that could be subpar in some rook endgames, and there Harikrishna goes. By the way, Dominguez has won his game against Mamedyarov. No surprise there, given the position that Mamedyarov had. but a very bad news for the India Yogis.
Yep, certainly.
And okay, here Pentala Harikrishna is trying his best
Whoa.
what happened?
Sorry, Wesley just won his game.
Oh, oh my gosh, that was not expected. Look what happened here. Queen f7 played by Wesley going after this pawn on h5. And after king h6, Narayanan blunders his knight on e7 because after queen e7, there's knight f5 check with the fork, winning the queen back. Oh, this match was going so decently, so well for the India Yogis, but this round is a problem.
Yeah, certainly so. I guess let's focus on the games that are still ongoing here. At least Adhiban is winning his game. It seems like he just put in the final blow. I think we're going to get a resignation from Jeffrey Xiong soon. Bishop g5, pinning the rook. He's about to take on c1, and then he's up 2 pawns here in a pretty comfortable position where he could just, keep pushing the c pawn, protect it with the b pawn, bring his king in, and it's a clear win.
Indeed. And we just go back to see how this happened. And there's a resignation as I was trying to pull up how it happened. He just went for the pawns. He just took all of them. He said, I can't take on d3 because of the back rank problems, but now you have too many pieces under attack here. So he stole the pawn on c3. He took the bishop, and then look at that move. Rook takes e3 here. And the problem is now you get rid of the coordination. Fantastic tactical find. If rook took on e3, you lose the rook on c1. The queen doesn't protect it. If you do what happened in the game, we'll show you in a second, took on c3 at first, I take on c3 back, I'm up 2 rooks and a bishop for a queen, way too much material. So finally, he took with a queen on e3, and then there was bishop g5 with a skewer on the diagonal. A really nice win there for Adhiban.
Yeah, Adhiban is one of the MVPs for the Indian Yogis right now with 2.5 out of 3. Very impressive score.
No, Adhiban lost.
1.5. Sorry, 1.5, but he's still leading overall for the Indian Yogis since Narayanan is the only other one with 1.5 so far.
Right. And Harikrishna, who has 1 out of 2 thus far, he's trying to make this endgame work against Caruana. But this king on g1 looks like it's in danger. The problem is that the knight on g3 covers that square on h1. So unless he can reroute this rook in some meaningful way, but it doesn't work. Actually, what Fabiano is going for gives white these outside pass pawns, these queenside pawns over here. And there isn't going to be a checkmate, at least not that I see anytime soon, with his knight so nicely covering the h1 square.
Right. And so rook h4, there's no way to protect the g-pawn. So I guess black can just capture it. It doesn't seem that he's trying to go for any checks. As you mentioned, the knight is a great blockading piece here. So why is he allowing Harikrishna to get those 2 pass pawns? What is his play here?
Well, he lost one of them in exchange for the pawn that was on the h-file for white. And now Harikrishna's pushing this pawn up the board, and the rook on f4 can't get behind the pawn so easily. He'll have to try rook d4, rook d1, rook b1. But maybe Harikrishna has a way to start pushing the a pawn as well. He needs the dual effort of his pawns here. So rook b3, it's looking like bishop b7 just blockades it, and it's hard to remove that bishop from the square. It shows the dominance of bishops over knights in certain positions.
Right. And instead of playing rook b3, should white maybe consider rook c1 so that he can get his rook behind the pawn to b1 here? Because if you play rook b3, then black gets rook d1 and bishop b7.
Right, and he played rook c1, so you had a good idea here. Bishop b7 can still be played at some moment, but you're right. Protecting from b1 does seem to be better, as now your knight can move from g3 if it so chooses. As the knight couldn't move earlier with rook d1 check and rook h1, but now you can move this knight. But 10 seconds for Harikrishna. We've already seen players lose on time. This is not an easy position to play either. So rook back to b8 for Fabiano.
Uh-oh, rook b8. Is that just winning the b7 pawn?
He looks like it. He wanted to go after the f5 pawn. And the good news is if the rooks get traded, there are very good drawing chances for white. because there aren't that many pawns remaining. But this is not, of course, what Harikrishna wanted.
Right. And the issue also is that even if he would take on f5, rook
Ooh.
a7 would follow up.
He blundered. Fabiano blundered, and he missed knight h5. Sorry to interrupt you there, but he just totally forgot it. He just totally forgot that knight h5 comes, and now you're losing f4 with check, and now it's white who has the advantage because of this outside pass pawn.
He played very quickly there. It seemed like he was trying to play fast so that he wouldn't let Harikrishna think on his time control, but in doing so, he made a mistake as well.
Wow. And that's the problem. You know how we talk about when you're in time trouble or your opponent's in time trouble, you try to move very quickly? This is an example of when moving quickly backfires. And rook h8 here, it tries to threaten checkmate on h1. So you can go for it because you can't queen as white, but you can just play knight to g2 and say, hey, wait a sec, you're not mating me when my knight blocks your bishop's diagonal, and you'll just have to play rook b8 back.
Well, it does seem that rook takes b7 is a good way for Fabiano to just equalize here if he wants to. Do you think he should still be trying to push for a win?
There's just no way possibly to win here. And he took on b7. He didn't want to take on g5, which he could have done. But if you look at this position, right now we're in an endgame where only white can potentially win. I'm not saying white will win. And the reason why is the a pawn can be used as a decoy at some moment, and white is going to try to go after the double isolated g pawns. This is not easy. It objectively should be holdable, but it's not a fun position to play because black cannot afford to trade this bishop for the knight, as when you have just these pawns on the king side over here, the a pawn will be that decoy that I discussed. And here the bishop is losing the g4 pawn. If you go bishop d1, I go king d2, and I kick your bishop away from the protection of the pawn. So,
and if we play bishop g2 instead, so we're just giving up the pawn and going for a3, so all black has to do now is eventually sacrifice his bishop for the f-pawn. I guess it's a little bit more difficult because the knight can be used to try and block the path.
But you're absolutely correct in the sense that that's all that needs to happen. So this king can dart very quickly, and the king d4 is a smart move. It still should be a draw because the f-pawn can't get to f5, and so the black king can take a longer journey. The issue for white is you need the king on a square that will help kick this bishop off or not allow it to cover the f5 square.
Wow. And the king, say the king gets to e3, f2, g3, then the bishop, I guess, can just go around to the other side.
Yeah, exactly. So there's just, sadly, knights and the pawns. You really need the same colored bishop if you're going to try to win an endgame like this, because the knight can't actually blockade the bishop's path, and the bishop will always sacrifice for the pawn.
Wow. Well, this was a really back and forth game. We thought both players had chances here, so a draw almost feels like an equal result. A fair result, sorry.
It's definitely an equal result, but I agree with you as well. It is a fair result. It seemed like for the start of the position, we slightly preferred Harikrishna. Then all of a sudden, it looked a bit dangerous for him. He held on despite having just seconds on his clock, and Harikrishna's 1.5 out of 3. He's been solid. Unfortunately, that Narayanan loss of the knight, I mean, his position was already looking tough, I must admit, but that is not what the India Yogis were hoping for. And for Mamedyarov, you just can't play like that. That was a huge missed opportunity with the white pieces against Dominguez. Just getting your king hunted down like that, not a good look for the Yogis, but Mamedyarov does have one round to bounce back. And Alexandra, before we take our break, I have to ask you, with the St. Louis Archbishops now in the lead, do you think they hold on for a match victory?
I'm going to stick to my prediction. I think they are going to end up winning the match, probably still by a 2-point margin. But we'll be back and we'll see if that is a accurate prediction.
chess capital of Europe. Meet and greet and simul with Magnus Carlsen. It's the Pro Chess League Finals at Chess Party 2020. Caruana, So, Botez, Hammer, Rudolph, Chess Bras, an open Fisher Random Chess Tournament. Will you be part of the world's biggest chess party?
And if today's match was not enough of a chess party for you, the ultimate chess event in Norway, May 22nd, 24th, Chess Party. This is what the Pro Chess League is presented by Alexandra. How fun does the chess party sound?
It sounds like a great time. We're going to have awesome company there. You're going to be there. We have Wesley So, who has been playing incredibly today, Fabiano, Magnus, Anna, the Chess Bras, and hopefully a lot of the viewers who are here with us today. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, we hope we're going to see you there.
Definitely. And well, the India Yogis hope that they will make it there. But right now, their season is on the line because in this quarterfinal matchup against the St. Louis Archbishops, they are down 1 point, 6.5, 5.5, because of some sloppy play by Mamedyarov, capturing with the wrong pawn and getting his king just obliterated, honestly, and losing that battle. And then Wesley So playing extremely well for the Archbishops.
Certainly. And I'm really looking forward to the board one matchup with Caruana and Mamedyarov. We're going to see if Mamedyarov is able to come back from his 1 out of 3 score so far. What are your predictions on that game?
Wow. If I were Fabiano, I would play kind of a slow, methodical approach to see how my teammates are doing. Because the problem with just going forward against Mamedyarov is he's a beast of a calculator. Like, that guy's tactical vision is one of the absolute world's best. So I wouldn't really want to get in a slugfest against him in time trouble. So I'd play just a standard, maybe in English or some kind of more positional approach rather than a tactical battle.
That is a great plan. Maybe you should be a team captain for one of the Pro Chess League teams, Robert. I think they'd be happy to have you. I mean, lucky to have you, but so are we here as the commentators. Let's see if the Indian Yogis can come back with probably one of the biggest wins of the season if they're somehow able to turn things around against St. Louis.
Yeah, it would be a huge victory and a shock to the rest of the league because, as Li Chao said, if the China Pandas won their matchup, it's pretty much St. Louis Archbishops or bust. And he is very modest, and he's kind of, I would say, underplaying the chances of the China Pandas. But this game here, while we're getting back to the chess board, look what Mamedyarov has done. He has taken a kind of a risky strategical setup because the pawn on c7, the pawn on b5 are separated, and you'd much rather have your pawn back on b7 in many of these lines because you look at a square like c6, you look at a knight on f3 that would love to get into that square. But for now, knight a5 played by Mamedyarov. And honestly, Alexandra, I know this position when the bishop is on b3 and the pawn is back on d4, but with the bishop on c2, I am not quite as familiar with this, and I like the scope of the bishop on g7.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised that Mamedyarov is going for something that is so sharp. I guess it does make sense since they're behind a point here, and he's trying to not give Fabiano the opportunity to just stay really solid and go for a draw, depending on how the other boards are doing here. Black's position does look a little bit uncomfortable in terms of how much space he has, but now he's putting pressure on d5. That pawn has definitely been overextended here, so I'm actually starting to prefer Black's position here. It seems very fun to play.
Yeah, it really does. And there are different sides for both players. And that's always interesting to note because he just castled. He'll take back on c6 eventually. The pawn's not going anywhere. If it goes to c7, well, thank you. I'll gladly take that with the queen. But because the sides have different plans, it makes it somewhat harder because you're sort of seeing whose idea will happen first or whose idea is better in the first place. And a4 is just trying to take some control over the queen side. Black already has his pawn on b5, is controlling important squares. By playing a4, you make the rook on a1 look more useful if the file were to open up, as it might after a takes b5, a takes b5 as well.
Mm-hmm. And Black took with the knight on c6 so that he could use his knight on a5 to block the a file so that he could take back with the pawn on b5 without being pinned. A move like b4 would look really nice for white if it weren't for that pesky bishop on g7 having so much control on the board here. Knight b3 is another good way to put pressure on the knight and take advantage of the fact that it is pinned. Maybe Black should just develop the bishop on c8 so that he can protect his rook on a8, and that should solve most of the tactical problems in the position in the short term.
Yep. And there are some pawn weaknesses, d6, b5, but I think that's offset by how active Black is. And you're right that developing the bishop protects the rook on a8. That's very important. So I do believe that Mamedyarov should be quite happy, and he plays bishop g4, should be quite happy with how this position has developed. I'm like you, I like the activity in his position.
Certainly. Well, this is the final round, so maybe we'll look at some of the other boards as well. We want to have an overview of what is going on here. I'm taking a look at the game between Adhiban and Wesley. That one looks a little more interesting than some of the other options.
Let's pull that game up here. Queen a5 check, and Wesley offered a draw. Do you see that in the game chat there? So yeah. Interesting. Wow, that comes as unexpected to me.
Yeah, it makes me think that maybe this is part of some theoretical line that is really drawish, which I'm just going to quickly check with the opening book to see if that's the case. But nope, the theory here ended much earlier. It ended on b5, actually.
Yeah, this kind of b5 approach is seen as risky. And you, in general, with the Grunfeld, you want to get at the white center. You've given white 2 pawns in the center to your 1, but you play for c5. And with a pawn on b5, you can even play b4 to just break down the pawn structure. But in this game, he played queen a5 check and offered a draw. He is the black pieces. He's playing Adhiban, who is super talented, very tough opponent. And he figures, hey, a draw is good for the team. So I'm going to offer it. And if he doesn't accept, now he feels the pressure to play for a win because he declined in the first place. And it's just a good psychological test to ask your opponent.
Certainly. And so white has 3 options here. He can block with bishop d2, queen d2, or he can even try for king f1. Would a queen trade favor white or black in this position?
Well, the queen trade can be standard of most Grunfelds that have an early c takes d4, c takes d4, and a check on a5. But on one hand, white has this nice center. On the other, there's a king on d2. Black can put pressure on the pawn on d4 by castling and putting a rook on d8. And if you ever play d5, you open up the length of the diagonal for this bishop on g7. It's the beautiful Grunfeld piece. So it's not an easy choice to make here. And if you're Adhiban with this draw offer still on the table, I was about to say he can agree to it at any point. I would have just left that offer for a couple more minutes because his inclination was to take it, that I would continue looking to see how my teammates were doing. And let's say I went down to 2 minutes, but I needed to win. Well, then a draw is the same as a loss at that point. So I would have sat on the draw for a little longer.
Right, because you could take it at any point. So I think that's a really good strategy, and maybe he just didn't consider it.
Yep. So let's keep looking at the teammates. Let's go to the game between Dominguez and Harikrishna. Dominguez has just played this move, queen c4 to b5, hitting a pawn on a5, hitting a pawn on e5. And, well, it looks really nice here for Dominguez, who's playing very quickly as well.
Yeah, I like his position a lot because of how difficult it is to keep holding on to the a5 pawn. Black would have to play a move like rook a8, taking his rook off of the open file. Otherwise, I don't see how he's going to protect the pawn. Maybe he's just going to let white take it. Because rook a8 and rook d1 looks terrible for black.
Yeah, and the e5 pawn is also hanging, so it's like you got to choose which pawn you're giving up at this point, and it looks really unpleasant. So black needs to gain some counterplay here. And unfortunately, the entire D file is under white's control, despite there being a black rook on D8. You can't go to D4, you can't go to D3, you can't go to D2, D1, D5. Like all of those squares are under white's control. So, if you lose one pawn, it's not like you have the immediate compensation of pushing your rook down the board. In fact, white has most of it under control.
Yep. So this is looking just very, very hard to play for Harikrishna here. And taking a look at the position between Narayanan and Jeffrey Seong, that one is also interesting. We got 4 knights on c4, c5, d4, d5, just blockading the 2 open files. The position is currently equal in material, but it seems like there's about to be some breaks. Whenever we see so much tension, I'm just excited to see who's going to be the side to break it first.
Yeah, there is a lot going on here. And it plays e5, kicking the knight from d4 because the b3 pawn is protected by that knight and only that knight. But at the same time, look at the h7 square, the bishop on b1. So you have to be careful when you just only have a bishop on f6 guarding the king side. But e5 played. Now, where can this knight go? Into f5 is one option. It can, in some ways, stay on d4, but you have to be very careful when you do something like that. My point was going to be like, if I went knight d2, ed4, ed4, the knight c5 is pinned, but the bishop on b7 staring at this diagonal and the pawn on g2, and feels like you're really asking for trouble, and the pawn on d4 is pinned to boot. So you can't even take on c5 with that pawn. So this looks like a very bad sacrifice for white. And if that's the case, you got to find somewhere to move that knight. And
if we do move the knight to f3, what is the issue with just retreating there? The pawn on b3, like you mentioned. And then there's no tactics with the open c file because the rook is under attack. Right.
Yeah, and queen c2 will hit h7 and the knight on b3, but the king can escape. The check on h7 is not mate in this position. So after knight c1, queen h7 check, king f8, kind of running out of checks very quickly, and black is up material.
Well, the more we look at it, the more difficult this position seems for white. When we came initially, it just seemed like there was a lot of tension held by both sides, but a closer look sees that white is the one with the bigger weaknesses in this position. So Narayanan has been sitting here for about 2 minutes so far. You could tell he's in trouble.
Yes, indeed. This is not good news for the India Yogis, who came into the round down a point. He plays knight f3 at the end of that, but knight takes b3 looks like a move that black can escape with and just be very happy about the position.
Well, things are not looking too good. I'm looking now at the game between Caruana and Mamedyarov. It looks, well, it looked a little level. It still does look even. We have equal pawns. Black has a pass pawn on the b file, but it seems like this is just going to end in a draw, which is not good news because the Yogis are just down too many points.
Yeah, for Mamedyarov, you'll have to try to give up some of your kingside pawns and rush the b pawn down the board. But the issue with that is, let's say you play rook to b1, eventually pawn to b2. That still is a position that makes actually white's life easier to make a draw. So I'll put that on the board. So let's say rook to b1, rook to b8, something like this, pawn to b2. The issue is your rook can't move away. And the only way your rook can move is if your pawn becomes protected. In order to protect the pawn, your king has to run to a square like c3, in which case white will check the king from behind a bunch and then eventually put the rook back behind the passed pawn. So as long as your king cannot remain protecting that pawn, white can put the rook behind it and your rook is stuck on a square like b1.
Really great explanation there. It's helpful to look at the position you think you're going to get in an endgame and figure out what would need to be the conditions for it to be winning. But as you just showed, there's not a lot of there's no way to make progress for either side here.
Yep. So let's go back to the Jeffrey game because that one's more interesting. It's potentially a tactical solution here. And Wesley So has been chatting away in the game chat for this one, telling Jeffrey, just win. Just win. And it's funny that Wesley's always in there just chatting with the people watching. It's good for chess to see a super GM like Wesley giving his input. But right now, knight takes b3. We were looking at this earlier. I feel like it's just a good win of material for black.
Yep. So I think this is I mean, we already looked at this line, and Narayanan is still thinking. He's just really working through his time here. I think we should let him sit, see what he figures out, and also take a look at LDP's game, just because there's been more progress there since the players have actually made some moves.
Okay, well, Lanier is up a pawn, and it's this nice looking outside pass pawn to a5. The e5 pawn is vulnerable. The b2 pawn is vulnerable. The e4 pawn could come under fire. So right now, with white to move, you can actually capture this pawn on e5. Knight takes e5 is just a pawn that is more or less free, but queen takes b2, you have to consider the consequences of a rook and knight endgame, which to me looks amazing winning chances for white, putting my rook behind the passed pawn and starting to push it. So I'm loving Lanier's chances in this one.
And the bright side is, even if he somehow ends up drawing this game, his team will still win the match. So he is not feeling too much pressure in this position.
Right. And that's really a good place to be, because now that Fabiano and Mamedyarov have drawn their game, and Wesley and Adhiban drew theirs, and with Narayanan's position looking suspicious at best, it feels like Dominguez can safely push for the full point and be content to have the half point score match victory.
Definitely. So we just saw queen takes b2.
Yep.
And I guess white can go for that queen trade idea here, or just try to support the a pawn to continue moving towards a8. Maybe something like, would a6 right away be an idea that white could try to go for here?
Absolutely. Advancing the pawn seems like a good approach. The only issue is if your pawn goes too far, then black can kind of corral it and win it. So yeah, it's still looking really good for white. The thing you don't want to have happen is losing your a pawn, even if you get the black e pawn, because having the outside pawn as a distraction, a decoy, forcing all of black's attention to it is a nice benefit of white's position.
Certainly. Well, we've looked at what's going to happen here, so we're probably going to see the line you suggested with queen takes e5. LDP is also up a lot on the clock. He's over 4 minutes to Harikrishna's 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Would you say that Harikrishna had a comeback in this match, 1.5?
Yeah, he scored a very important second round win, and then he drew against Caruana. And at this point, it's not just about his game. He's looking at the match score, but I don't want to give him too much of an excuse, because he was just outplayed. I mean, Dominguez clearly got an advantage when we saw the position with queen to b5, and he lost one pawn and now might even lose a second. So good play by Dominguez in this match. He lost one game on time, but other than that, he's been excellent.
Yeah, and that one game can happen to anyone. He probably just forgot about his clock.
Indeed. So it looks like Jeffrey, if we switch over there, just to show that one, because if Jeffrey wins the game, the match is officially over, and the St. Louis Archbishops will be victorious. So let us go to the game between Jeffrey Zhang and Narayanan with queen took on c4. So what the current material count is an extra exchange for black, whose king will be perfectly safe on e7, not to mention that the white king is probably in the worst shape due to back rank checkmates.
Right, and on top of that, the bishop on c3 is pinned. He can't move because the rook is actually hanging. Like you mentioned, the back rank is in a lot of trouble here. So not only is Jeffrey up material, but he's probably going to be winning even more. B takes c3 is just a free bishop here.
Yeah, h4, saying I need to get my back rank, give my king some luft, but some luft but no love for this white king, as black's now a full rook in the position, and now it's just liquidating. The queen will take on h4, forcing a queen trade. Queen takes h4, you can just resign, because at best white will win this rook on c8 and be down a full piece.
And this is the plan he went for. It's often a good idea to just go for some type of simplification, and I don't think anyone needs to test Jeffrey being up a full piece in an endgame like this. So we just saw the resignation from Narayanan, and it is official. The St. Louis Archbishops win this match, but we still have one game left to see what the final score will be.
Yeah, so a nice victory for the Archbishops, a true test by the India Yogis. They were tied 4-4, and things got out of hand as the Archbishops showed their might in these final 2 rounds. And Dominguez still trying to win this game here with the white pieces against Pentala Harikrishna, and e5 was played, attacking this knight on f6, saying, well, I'll gladly trade knights, and here after knight d7, I'm expecting rook e4 as he just played to protect this knight, and the knight on c4 is so nice, protecting both the a5 and the e5 pawns.
Certainly. And white being up 2 pawns here, we definitely know that white is the one who's most likely to win here, but it's still helpful to try to figure out what the plan would be. So would you recommend trying to bring in your king as quickly as possible, starting off with king f1, or is there some tactical variation that you prefer with potentially just trying to go for the pawn pushes?
Yeah, it's a good question, because king f1, you can play f4 to start trying to advance your second pass pawn. And what black is trying to do is, as quickly as possible, go after this a5 pawn. The issue becomes, if you play, let's say, f4, knight c6, and white plays a6, it does take a little bit of time for your rook to attack this pawn on a6, because the a5 square is under white's control. You would play a move like rook to b5, rook to b1 check, rook to a1, and then finally get after this pawn. But it's a bit of a long story, and white will just sit and allow it to happen.
Yep. Well, what do you think the trickiest defending plan is for black here?
Probably at some moment play knight c6, but he played f4 to start with. It just feels like white has everything under such control that even if you win the a pawn, with a knight coming to d6 at the right moment, your f7 pawn will also be weak. Just too many issues for black to deal with.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we'll see how they continue to finish this off. But I want to shout out to the people who are guessing on this game. We have Bad Bishop with 8 points out of 26. PS Thorbell with 7 out of 21. Just a reminder to everybody, you could still be playing Guess the Move on this last game. We never know which one the money game is. We as commentators don't know yet. But if this is the game, you can get in there and try to predict these last moves, which are going to be a lot easier than the earlier ones, since it's in a much more simple to understand position, since white is winning in this endgame.
Yep, and rook e2, trying to go rook to b2. That's why Harikrishna went rook c5, avoiding a forced exchange of rooks in this ending. And kudos to Leonard Dominguez, who bounced back from that pretty inexplicable loss on time. I don't know if it was just internet or if he didn't see his clock. We saw Maxime Vachier-Lagrave lose on time last week to Karu Nakamura. So this does happen to these super grandmasters. And in this game, it doesn't matter because the match is already locked up. It's a victory for St. Louis, but it would be terrible to lose this final game on time.
Yeah, that would just be souring to LDP after his flag that already happened here.
So knight a7, trying to get this a6 pawn. The knight on c4 is trapped. So not trapped, pinned, pardon me. So rook c6 is threatening to take on a6. Knight e3 will be met by rook a5, and there's no way for the rook to protect the pawn on a6. But I do believe that a simple rook c7, rook takes a6, kind of knight to f5, knight to d6 maneuver, going after the f7 pawn is very strong as well.
And this was just played on the board, so it looks like this is a variation we're going to see. And I think this was actually really instructive, because even if he was up a pawn, a lot of times he has to go for some type of other weakness in black's camp. And it seems to be the lack of activity in the king side here, and also the fact that the dark knight and rook were both so distracted trying to recapture the pawn that they're not there to protect the black kingside pawns now.
Totally true. That, you have bettered the quantity situation. You've gained a pawn back, but the quality of your pieces are clearly bad, especially this knight on a7. And king to g8 was just played by Harikrishna. In comes the knight to d6, and f6 played. The knight on d6 is protected by this pawn on e5. So what Harikrishna is hoping for is to sort of remove the guard and start trading off some pawns. But
Knight f5 looks really tempting here. Put pressure on g7. The g pawn can't move because h6 is also hanging. Oh, he decided to take instead. If rook takes d6, black can capture the knight on a7.
yeah, I'll capture g7 first, intermezzo, and then take the knight on a7.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So another interesting idea for white here would even be to just play king g3 and try to get his king closer.
I liked your idea. Bringing the king in looked excellent. Knight takes h5 is possible because the rook cannot take down h5 and protect on a7. It's an overloaded piece. And so he plays knight. He just lost the third pawn.
Yeah. Oh, it's too lost at this point. 3 pawns, even with the time pressure. I guess LDP did lose on time in a drawn position before, but I don't think he's going to do it in a 1 position. I think he learned his lesson.
Yes, and he can just bail out at any moment. He's gaining time. This is they say always repeat, especially with increment, because when you repeat, you gain those 2 seconds. And now he can just push all of his pawns in any order, and he'll win the game.
Yeah. Rook's under attack. He'll move it away.
Yep. Now attacking this knight. Knights go to c7, only move really, but just keep on pushing the pawns.
Well, it looks like we're going to see a score of 9.5 to 6.5. Does that surprise you at all?
Not especially, just because of how strong St. Louis is, but by how this match was going, I really thought that we would have a closer finish. And I do believe the match is closer than the final score will indicate, but St. Louis deserved this, that's for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. The rook is now cutting off. White was even able to give up the rook for the knight, so lose an exchange here because his pawns are so close to promoting. f7 is coming. The only thing black will be able to do is sacrifice his rook to stop the pawn after the king gets to g7.
Yep.
And we have a resignation. It is official, 9.5 to 6.5.
And Dominguez always looks so calm. We did see him pretty upset after he lost that game on time, but he just no strong reaction. Another day at the office for him, a nice victory over a super grandmaster. And Dominguez and the St. Louis Archbishops win the match 9.5, 6.5. We will have a special guest for an interview after this short break, so stay tuned. We will be right back.
A premium membership at Chess.com will help you improve your game with full access to a powerful set of learning tools. Unlimited tactics let you practice like a master, with more than 50,000 puzzles to challenge you at every level. Our library of interactive chess lessons, created by master coaches, will enhance every aspect of your game. And after each game you play, the computer analysis feature will give you feedback on every move you played, turning every game into a chance to learn. And that's not all. Premium benefits also include unlimited tournaments, video lessons, the Opening Explorer, and much, much more. Upgrade now to take your game to the next level.
And we are joined by the St. Louis Archbishop's own Wesley So. Wesley, congratulations on a tough match, but a nice victory in the end.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing a great commentary and doing a good job today. But I also like to congratulate my teammates for this was a huge team effort, and it doesn't really matter how a single player does. The most important thing is for the team to reach 8 or 8.5, and we managed to achieve that, although not without some tension.
Yeah, Alexander, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and speaking of that tension, before we went back live, you were saying how you were feeling a little bit nervous in the middle there when it was tied 4-4. Did that change the way you were playing? Did the pressure get to you at all?
Yeah, it kind of did. I got a bit nervous after the second match because Jeffrey lost, and Adhiban played really well in that game and very aggressively. And then Dominguez, who had the winning position for quite a long time in the middle game, he made some mistakes, and he ended up losing in time on a draw ending. So that was the critical stage of the match, and India had a realistic chance of winning the match at that point when we were tied 4-4. And then I was playing Narayanan on the third match, and I knew he's a very dangerous player. But fortunately, I had white, and also fortunately today, the openings went very well for me. It's really important to have a good opening in fast games, and today everything worked out well in the opening. So,
yeah, and speaking of the opening, Wesley, in that final round, you offered a quick draw just out of the opening. My initial reaction was that Adhiban should not have accepted it until all of the other matches were a little bit clearer. But what was your mindset like when you proposed that draw?
Yeah, in hindsight, it might be a mistake by Adhiban to accept that draw. But because going into the final round, we were leading by 1 point. So we needed 1.5 out of 4. And I figured if I drew, then we're going to have to lose 2 games and 1 draw in order to lose the match. Because, but I really didn't think it was very likely that we'd lose 2 games because Fabiano and Dominguez both had the white pieces. So they both have the white pieces, and it's unlikely that they're gonna lose. And even if Jeffrey loses the last round, which he played very strongly and didn't, but even if he loses the last round and the other 2 white games ended in draws, we'd still end up in a tied match, and we'd still have good chances in the Blitz playoff. So I was thinking to play it safe, and I don't really mind the draw with the black pieces against a strong grandmaster like Adhiban. But with hindsight, you shouldn't have accepted the draw, of course.
Right. And I guess my question to you as well is, did you talk to your teammates before the round saying you might offer an early draw, or was that just something you went with because you calculated it would be good for your team?
No, it's actually funny, but in the Pro Chess League, we in all the matches that I played, our team rarely talked to each other during the match. Well, first of all, there's very little time between the games.
Right.
And secondly, in Chess.com, you have to make a chat request before you can chat with other players.
Well, it was entertaining to see you chatting alongside the other viewers on Chess.com, forgiving Jeffrey as long as he won that game. would you say when you are talking to the rest of your teammates that the dynamics are more serious, or you guys like to joke around more?
Uh, I'm not sure exactly how to answer, but when your team is leading the match, then everything's going well and everyone's happy.
Fair enough.
And our team has a lot of experience together. We know everybody well. Fabian and I have played in 2 Olympiads, the same team, and I've also met Jeffrey many times in tournaments, and we've also sparred before. So I know the players in our team very well. And for instance, Liam and I spar almost every week before the matches, and I think that helped a lot to build up team spirit.
Definitely, Wesley. And well, speaking of players that you know very well, it looks like you're going to be taking on the China Pandas in the semifinal. And none of those players are new to you. Very, very strong team. What do you make of St. Louis's chances against a team like China, which is probably the toughest team on paper you'll face all season?
Yeah, that's true. I would argue though that Canada is still stronger than China because Alireza Firouzja is just such an underrated player, and he's a beast in in speed time controls. You could very well argue that he's the best player in Canada in this time control. Um, yeah, well, first of all, China has to, or Chinese players have to pass the quarantine test at that point.
Yeah.
Before being able to enter Norway. But yeah, they have a really good team. I mean, they have Ding Liren and they have Wei Yi. And they have Yu Yang Yi. Sometimes Yu Yang Yi doesn't play very well, but yesterday he played really well. So they have a monster lineup on the first three boards. But I'm confident with our team. You know, we have Fabiano Caruana, who who in good form is the best player in the world, and we have Lenier, who is always stable. You can count on him to deliver every single week. And then we have Le Quang and we have Jeffrey, who are also very tricky players. So I'm
And
confident.
they have you, Wesley. Don't you know? I know you're being very humble. You always are. But when I'm looking at the St. Louis lineup, I see Wesley So performing extremely well every single week.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to play and participate in the Pro Chess League and to play for St. Louis. But yeah, honestly, my performance this season has been a surprise even to me.
Well, Alexandra, I don't know if you're surprised because I'm not.
No, I'm not surprised, but it's always really humbling to see Wesley's attitude and how much he props up his teammates. Maybe you should give yourself more credit as well, Wesley.
Well, actually, yeah, the most important thing is to for the team to win again. But thank you both for your kind words.
Well, on that note, Robert, do you have any more questions, or should we thank Wesley and tell the viewers what the money game was?
I have one final question. I know I've asked him this before. Has your opinion changed about the candidates and who your favorite is? And what do you make of MVL joining the fray? Do you think that will change who you perceive as being the favorite, or still Fabiano Caruana?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the tournament has changed a bit with the inclusion of Maxime, because Maxime is very determined to do well. I mean, he got into the candidates in the last minute, and I think now is his time to. This is his first candidates tournament, and I think now is his time to prove that he deserved to be there. But overall, I think Fabiano is just too strong. If Fabiano plays like he did, even if he plays like 90% or 85% of his strength as he played in Waikante, then I'm quite confident that he would win. And I think he prepared very hard for the candidates. He hasn't played anything other than the Pro Chess League after Waikante. So I think he's prepared hard. We obviously seen some of his seconds in camera.
Yep.
And
that was funny.
yes,
Well,
yes.
Wesley, I have one final question for you that I just thought of. How excited are you to do commentary with me? I'm pretty sure you're joining some candidates commentary, right? So you can be honest with everybody. Are you excited to find commentary with me?
Well, I think you're more excited that you don't have to commentate with Danny.
Oh no.
Yeah, speaking of which, where is Danny today?
Danny's on vacation. My feelings will also go on vacation for now after that. But Wesley, thank you as always for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure, and congratulations once again on such a superstar performance.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Well, there you have it, Wesley So. Always super kind, super humble, doesn't take any credit despite the fact that he's been such a force for the St. Louis Archbishops, but he was a participant in the money game against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. The winner, surprise, surprise, Alexandra. I know you're just absolutely shocked by who wins the $50.
Dragon B70. I haven't seen that name before. With 20 out of 28, we've seen Dragon B70 guessing consistently on so many of these games, and I think Dragon has won as well in the past.
He's just a monster. And well, Dragon B70, congratulations once more. We have some Diamond membership winners, Chess Chief. We have Simply Luca and Aquatic Guitar, as well as Yura 1769. So let's go back to the bracket one last time, as we now have a new entrant into the semifinals. That is the St. Louis Archbishops. They take on the Pandas, and on the other side of the bracket, well, remains to be determined. So Alexandra, Canada versus Chicago, Armenia versus New York. Who you got?
Those are both going to be interesting matchups. The Armenian Eagles have historically proven to be a very likely team to make it in the Final Four. So I would say Armenia Eagles are the favorites in that matchup. The Chess Bras are definitely the favorite against Chicago Wind, but Chicago Wind has been playing very well. Obviously, there was some controversy in their match against the Russian Wizards, but it's still going to be a tough match regardless.
That's for sure. Chicago on paper is the heavy underdog against Canada. We heard Wesley So compliment Alireza Firouzja, calling him even the best player in this format, perhaps the entire league. I do believe the St. Louis Archbishops have several players, including Wesley, who can contend for that title, but Canada should be the heavy favorite against Chicago. And I also see New York being quite a sizable favorite against Armenia. But then again, Armenia's the lower rated team pretty much every single time they try to line up, and yet still took the 1 seed in their division.
Right. I mean, the Armenian Eagles, they just play so well as a team that I don't look at their rating individually when thinking about the matchup and their chances for winning.
Definitely. Well, Hikaru Nakamura will take part in that matchup with New York versus Armenia. He will receive the raid after the show is over, which, I'm pretty much done. I'm out of breath at this point. I love seeing such quality chess. The St. Louis Archbishops, in my opinion, certainly deserve that victory. They convinced me. They seem like the team to beat, though they will have a tough match ahead of them. So, Alexandra, anything to summarize today's action before we go and probably eat some lunch?
I think we had a lot of excitement at that middle point of the match when the Indian Yogis were tied 4-4. Like Wesley said, he was getting nervous as well. But in the end, the St. Louis Archbishops came and lived up to their reputation and ended up winning by a 3-point margin. So I think we were not surprised to see them as the favorites, but still they had to put up more of a fight. And on that note, we are going to be heading out. Robert, pleasure doing commentary with you. For those watching, we're going to give a raid to Grandmaster Hikaru if you guys still want to watch some chess, so stick around.
Thanks, everybody.